So when Mark invited me here, he didn't tell me that I was going to follow NASA and the fourth generation space architect, so no big deal. I can maybe top that or add my own little flavor to it by saying that I tried to be an architect as well. I'm from New York City. I was accepted to Cooper Union in 1988 when it was still a free school, and expelled from Cooper Union in 1989. So that's something I like to tell students is, don't worry, you can get kicked out of architecture school and still be on the stage with the deputy administrator of NASA and a fourth generation space architect. So don't give up. Okay, so my name's Eric. I'm from, I live in San Francisco now. I'm a transplant from New York. I run a design company called Stamen, and I've been working on a project with the Dalai Lama that launched in the New York Times last week, and so I'm starting to talk about it in public. That's him. I took this picture. He brought the Mickey Mouse ears. I'll explain about this in a minute, but I want to talk just a little bit about the kind of context for how I got into this arrangement and how I got to be in a position to post that photo on Instagram. I think that mostly when we think about maps and data visualizations, my company does maps and data visualizations. That's what we've done for 15 years now. And I think the kind of general way that people think about maps and data visualizations is that they're there to inform you, right? You pull out a map, you want to know where you are, you want to know where the nearest Muji is, that kind of stuff. My premise has been that I'm interested in a lot more than that when it comes to maps and data visualization. I'm interested in all the different kinds of expressions that can come out of maps and data visualization. I had a colleague once that said that if we held maps to the same standards that we held language, we'd never have Shakespeare. We'd never have any comic books. There's a lot of things that we would miss out on. So what are the creative possibilities? What are the communicative possibilities? What kinds of stories can we tell with maps beyond just how to get from where you are to where you want to go? So my journey, since we're talking about journeys, in this piece kind of started with this project for CNN, which was done during the Iraq War. And the project was designed to show the locations of coalition fatalities in Iraq and Afghanistan and their hometowns. And just that simple activity of kind of showing that these dots on maps, that these things that we're sort of seeing in the news every day have real people associated with them, real places, and that there's real stories that you can tell. And sort of from the outset, we said, this is not something that we want to just take and drop on a Google map, right? Shouldn't be a bunch of red pins on a satellite image that's taken from blue marble. It should be somber, it should be considered. It should be solemn, because we're talking about something quite solemn. This is a big thing that happened, and there's a great human cost to what we did. So on the left, the locations of the casualties from the United States, and then on the right, the places where they died. And the larger the size of the dot, the larger. So you can do things like look at Kabul, and you can see on the right, those are all the coalition soldiers that died in Kabul, and on the left is where they're from. So I took a look as I was coming over here to see who had died from Manhattan in Iraq, and I could find one guy. He lived in Manhattan. He died in Camp Wolverine. That's him. There's a whole kind of backstory to this too, where family members are encouraged to post memories and those kinds of things. Then I started to take a look at Queens, where I'm from. And there's one soldier from Queens who died in Afghanistan as well. He died in Kandahar. So just this idea that you would sort of, not just sort of take this information and wang it on any kind of map, but to really consider, let's make it dark, let's make it somber, let's make it something that we, can use to explore and to inform, of course, but then also to really kind of remind us of what happened there. So kind of taking that forward and thinking about the kind of power of maps to talk about things and tell stories and to inform, we recently finished a project. This is in January with the University of Richmond. They have a digital scholarship lab there. They commissioned us to develop a digital atlas of American history based on some work that was done in the 30s by Richard Pollan. So there's a number of different maps. There's maps of the movement of slaves, the forced migration of slaves from one place to the other in the United States. There's canals and things like that. But the one I like to talk about is this foreign-born one. This one is so I'll just get started. So we've got. I hope you can see it well. Is there any way these lights can come down at all? Does that happen? Okay. So we've got the United States in the center, a timeline at the bottom. So there's 1870. This is a map of the foreign-born population of Queens in the 1870. And the percentage is 25.8%. We've got mostly Ireland, Germany, England, and Wales, and a very few from Canada. It's to be expected. As we move forward, the story stays quite European for a long time. And Queens is such a fascinating place. I think it's the most ethnically diverse municipality on the planet. And as we go across, the numbers stay pretty high. Do I get a pointer here? No. Anyway, it says 1910, 27.9%. Kind of keeps going like that for a while. And for a good long while, my parents are from Germany, and they grew up with this kind of view of Queens, this kind of Italy, Germany. The block that I grew up on in Queens was Italian and German. And then this starts to get interesting. In the 1970s, this sort of the census has some really funny things. Look at the top there. It says America, other. Like they didn't, it's just like someplace else. The Canada and Mexico are basically the same in the census, and this kind of goes on. 1980, then the top. South America, unspecified, 75,000 people. And then there's this kind of gigantic demographic shift where you can kind of see this getting a little bit, so in 1990, the thing just totally changes in Asia, just totally explodes. And then here's the picture, here's the picture in 2000, European population really drastically reduced and much more from Asia and from Latin America. But what I also find really fascinating is this 46.1%. It's kind of amazing, this kind of multivariate, kind of teeming, overlapping diaspora is a phrase we like to use. So it looks quite different when you look at where I'm from, San Francisco, and this is just a totally different kind of situation. So in the beginning, of course, it's a very different place, much younger. But in the beginning, same kind of thing, 1870, mostly Irish, German, and then you see a bit of China there. That's, I think, the main difference of kind of early San Francisco and early, obviously because it's on the West Coast, but we were importing tons of Chinese immigrants to come and work on the railroads. So we've got, the Chinese are the third highest ethnic group in California, in San Francisco in 1870. Moving forward, it gets even a little bit more. They move up a bit, they bump out the Germans. 1890, they're right up there, one of the three ethnic groups. And then in 1900, it starts to really go down. If you just take a look at China, it's like right up there with Germany and Ireland. And then going down a bit in 1900, and then suddenly in 1910, no Chinese at all. And it kind of moves forward a little bit. 1920, still mostly European. 1930, 1940, still no Chinese. Where do they all go? 1950, and then 1960, we suddenly have this gigantic Chinese population again. So we thought this was kind of weird, and we went back and we took a look and asked the historians. And it turns out that in between 1890, 1900, and 1910, an act was passed called the it was called the Alien Exclusion Act. And that act did two things, one of which is well known and the other one is not. One is that it stopped all new Chinese immigration into the United States. And the second is that it forbade the census from counting foreign-born non-white people. So this gap in the data, it's this funny thing when you make maps and you do data visualizations. If you see a gap, you see something weird, there's one of three things that's going on. And in this case, it was either the data was broken in some way, or our map code was broken, or the United States has a racist immigration policy. So we needed to and there's going to be one of those three, and we had to figure it out. So I like to talk about this because I like this idea that when you're doing maps and you're doing data visualizations, we live in this age where there's basically this kind of one-to-one relationship we see between what's in the map on our hands and what's in the world around us. A good friend of mine's dad, the first time he saw an iPhone and his kid showed it to him, and he saw that blue dot, and he was in his house, and he's kind of looking around and seeing his neighborhood. He literally walked out the door of his house and then looked up and expected to see himself on the right. So there's this kind of expectation that it's just this kind of these maps are kind of stamped out by God's hand or Google's hand or whatever. And it's just not true, right? I mean, there's these kind of gaps, and this idea of, I'm glad to be on the same stage as these great explorers, because for us, the real excitement is in exploring the data, right? Is in kind of not just kind of going in and saying, all right, we're going to put a dot there and put a dot there, but really be open to questions and really try and understand what kinds of things we can discover. So it's that context. And then, San Francisco gets super interesting. So in that context, that got me here. And this is about a year and a half ago. That I started working with these two guys. On the left is Paul Ekman, who is a pretty well-known scholar and student of human emotions. He's famous for, in the 50s, going to Papua New Guinea and recording photographs and facial expressions of people who lived there who had never had any Western contact. He really wanted to understand the kind of scientific and the kind of evolutionary origins of emotions, and things like, do we learn them? Do we learn them at birth? How do we learn them? Really fascinating stuff. It's just as one of the many examples that roll off Paul's tongue. Infant children all have the same basic emotional structure because they haven't learned anything yet and they haven't developed, so they all have fear and those kinds of things. Blind infants have the same facial expressions as sighted infants. As people grow older, the sighted people's emotional facial development continues, but it happens less so in blind people because they're not getting the kind of feedback that we're getting. So just this kind of really kind of crisp interrelationship between the social and the scientific. So this is a meeting that we had on July 4th in Anaheim. The Dalai Lama brought the Mickey Mouse ears, which I was surprised at. But the Dalai Lama and Paul have been writing these books together for about 15 years. The Dalai Lama has a really different view of emotions than Westerners do, and especially that emotional scientists have. For example, there's no word in Tibet for mood. And so there's kind of really interesting and rich interplay that these two kind of giants of their respective worlds have been working on together. And so over the course of their conversation, they've done a lot of different projects. And about 2 years ago, the Dalai Lama, this is the, I'll just do it. So this is what it's like to pitch client work to the Dalai Lama. After this, I feel like I can ask anybody for money. It's kind of all goes down. That's what that looks like. This is we tried to get him to get pictures of him like using the mouse and stuff like that, and he said technology is for my next body. He's not a big web surfer. So we've been showing him prints. But about 2 years ago, he asked Paul to come up with a map of human emotions. He thought that there was value in a kind of scientific exploration of how emotions work. He's sort of a savvy guy. He knows that he can only reach so many people with his Buddhist teachings, and he thought, I'm going to reach out to my friend Paul Ekman. Let's do a map. Let's have that. Let's reach out to that kind of community. And so then Paul called me. And he said, the Dalai Lama wants me to make a map of human emotions. And I said, I have absolutely no idea how I can do that, and I'm on 100%. So let's figure it out together. So this is the drawing that kind of started it all. We've got anger in the center and hissy fit and a couple other things. Really just kind of a kind of thumbnail sketch. And in contrast to the way that we work on most of our projects, there's mostly there's large databases. There's the census. There's records of casualties. They exist in a database someplace. We approached this project initially assuming that Paul just had some database of everything that he knew about human emotion. Turned out he doesn't have any databases at all. He's written a couple books. So what we needed to do was to go kind of to the mattresses and pull out some paper. And it's been an interesting process for me who has been sort of living in this digital space for a long time and consuming live Twitter feeds and GPS and satellite imagery and all that stuff to go back to pen and paper. But that's what Paul needed, and so that's what we did. So this is the sketchbook that we used to make the map. Very, very basic. We started to do things like chart out the relationships between emotional states and actions and whether those were positive or negative. And the fun part about all this is that Paul, who's been studying this for 60 years, has simply never made maps of his own research before. So he's learned a lot during the process too, which has been super satisfying. So we started, and one of the real central challenges here is if you look on the right-hand side, there's the study was Paul asked 250 emotional scientists to say, which emotions do you think are kind of core human emotions? We're not talking about like love or pride. We're talking about like the core stuff, the stuff that sort of keeps us alive. And he said there's 5, or the scientist said there's 5. There's fear, anger, enjoyment, disgust, and I forget the other one. Thank you. Oh, right, it's on the screen. You do what you can. So we tried to we tried to make we tried to do this. So if in the center there's that kind of the circles. It says not this, right? So one of Paul's real concerns was, if we were to make a map and we put anger over here, sadness over here, and disgust over here, and we connect them all and we make them sort of all crisp, that implies that anger is halfway between disgust and sadness, and it's not. It just kind of doesn't work that way. They're not really you can't really fit them into a structure where the spatial relations make too much sense. So it's been a real challenge to come up with a map that's not a map, or a diagram that's not a diagram. And we went back and forth a lot. We talked a lot about things like how fear converts to shame and anger and those kinds of things. These were some kind of in desperation sketches of how to try to represent these things that I did in a bar. Some drawings, facial expressions, and how they could maybe open up. We just tried a bunch of stuff, but eventually we settled on this kind of basic structure. And I'll take you through the science, but I just thought you'd be interested in the kind of process, the way that these things get made. Again, you look at the way that maps used to get made, and a lot of times you didn't know where the Northwest Passage was, but you needed to make a map of what you knew. And I think people in previous times had a kind of different relationship to maps. They didn't necessarily feel like everything that was exactly on there was 100% known. Here's some drawings of the kind of initial structure of the different phases of emotions and kind of how their intensity levels. And then it came time to translate that into something digital. So after we were done with the drawings, we started on the making of it. And this is all live at atlasofemotions.com. So this is all animated too. I find when I make these slides, the simpler the better. So if you go on atlasofemotions.com, you'll see that these are all animated and flopping around. But we've got 5 emotional continents, and there they are. Let's see if I can remember them this time. Anger, fear, disgust, sadness, and enjoyment. The colors are coincidentally the same colors as were used in Inside Out, as are the emotions. And we talked to our lawyers and just to make sure that we weren't going to get sued for doing a derivative work, but we can document that we actually came up with the scheme before the movie came out. So that was interesting. And so every one of these emotions is made up of different phases. And one of the fun parts about the project has been treating them differently. Anger is a different kind of graphic presentation than disgust and sadness, and you'll see that. But anger is very spiky, and so this is a kind of illustration of the different states of anger. And one of the central concepts of the atlas is that it's not like you're just emotional or not emotional. It's that there are lots of different kinds of emotions, and there's lots of different ways to be emotional. In this case, there's lots of different ways to be angry. And so the idea is that on the left are the least intense emotions, and on the right are the most intense emotions. And then there's a bunch of ranges in between, and there's other things that come out of it. But just this base level idea that you're not just mad or not mad, but that there's different emotional states that correspond to different levels of emotional intensity. And I should say, I knew nothing about this before I started the project. And that's been sort of one of the fun parts about it, is just to learn. It's a great sort of exploratory practice. So for example, you can never be just a little bit furious. It doesn't work that way. If you're in fury, you're there. Whereas frustrated, you can be a little bit frustrated, or you can be like hyper frustrated. And then exasperation. This is one that I found really good. This is like, you left the toothbrush out again. That's exasperation. You're just like, you did it again, and that can be pretty intense. But you never become furiously exasperated. Then you move into things like vengefulness and bitterness. So that's kind of this first concept. And then all the other emotions are treated similarly. So this is fear. Fear is a little bit jitterier. And the first difference you'll notice between anger here and fear here is that there's a lot more states of fear that are only ever super intense. Right? Like, you're never just a little bit panicked, you're never just a little bit horrified, you're never just a little bit terrorized. Whereas dread can kind of go, you can be super dreadful, but not mildly in dread. And never, like, you can't be really wicked trepidatious. Disgust. These are my green mountains of poop. There are a few that are super intense: loathing and abhorrence and revulsion. That's kind of Holocaust stuff, where you're kind of like, dismissing, and kind of you're just that's just, and then dislike and repugnance in others. Sadness. This is our kind of blue, mopey kind of like emotional state. A lot more kind of on the higher range, but other ones that kind of go across. And there's a lot inside of here. So this is emotion, and then you get my favorite one here, Schadenfreude, which is I hope to experience Schadenfreude in November. I've been starting to get asked about language a bit, because it's obviously English, except for Schadenfreude. And there's just there's English words or there's emotions that English doesn't have a word for, but that we've kind of accepted. There's some other ones in here. There's Naches, which is the pride of your accomplishments of your offspring, the Yiddish word, and Fiero, which is an Italian word meaning you've accomplished something to the best of your abilities. So and again, I'm showing this. I've only talked about this in public a couple of times. The questions are starting to get interesting. The idea that some of these are kind of scientifically based and some of them are not, and this thing gets less and less scientific the further in the journey that I'm going to show you. So a few more things to talk about. So here's anger, and the idea is that different actions of anger. I can't go into all of these, but just to give you a sense of what's in there and encourage you to explore it yourself. That there's different actions that come out of different states of anger. The idea that some of the things that you can do are positive and some of them are negative, and as you interact with it, those things become clear. There's actions of fear. This I thought was kind of interesting. There's a lot more actions that come out of fear than come out of anger than come out of fear, right along the bottom there. There's very few actions that come out of disgust, and most of them are pretty intense. Another part of this that's kind of fun to talk about is that Paul will say things like, we know a lot more scientifically about fear than we do about disgust or sadness, because it's a lot easier to reliably and ethically frighten somebody in a lab than it is to ethically and reliably make them sad. So it's a bit woolly, but there's still some stuff to think about. So sadness, here are the actions that come out of that, actions that come out of an enjoyment. And so again, some of them are negative and some of them are not. There's some negative actions that come out of enjoyment, which is, there's a good one here, gloat. I like this one. When you're in Schadenfreude, you're gloating. It's your action. There's a concept of triggers that I have found quite useful. This idea that there's an event that happens and it triggers an emotion, and there's kind of nothing you can do about it. If your movement is interfered with, it triggers anger. It triggers an aggressive response. That's why babies get really mad when they can't move, or when people get stuck in traffic. It's a pretty core emotional thing. And so the question is, what are the actions that can come out of that, and what can you modulate? You can't stop yourself from feeling angry, but you can figure out what to do about it. And then lastly, there's a concept of mood, which is and this is the part that the Dalai Lama didn't understand, which is this mood. It's essentially a kind of filter that triggers actions that come into your, that filters the triggers that come in through your emotional database and cause you to sort of be more in the emotional state that you are. So it's kind of the least understood one, but it's like if you're in an irritable mood, you're more likely to respond in an angry way, even to something positive. And the whole point of all this is to give us a bit more emotional literacy so that we can achieve more of a calm state. And this is what the Dalai Lama has originally intended for the project, was to sort of give us a sense of, if we can kind of pay attention to our emotions and understand them, we don't necessarily need to be in the grip of them. We can be calmer. World peace. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to